Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Fee for Intervention Fight or Pay webinar hosted by Effective Software. Today and this morning, we are lucky to be joined by our two expert speakers, Bridget Leatley and Nick McMahon. Bridget is a freelance health and safety consultant, journalist, and trainer, focusing specifically on the changing technological, regulatory, and cultural environment within the health and safety space. Nick McMahon is Head of Health and Safety for Reynolds Porter Chamberlain, a global corporate law firm based in the UK. Nick advises clients facing scrutiny from bodies such as HSE, environment agencies, and fire authorities. I think one of the main reasons we brought FFI to the forefront of a webinar topic is because we held an event last October relating to the changing legal landscape of health and safety. And one of the big topics for discussion that Bridget was presenting was FFI. From our attendees, we seem to get a lot of feedback on the subject matter, and I think the main thing that was coming from the feedback was the overall ambiguity around the subject matter, and whether organisations should pay or should fight an FFI bill if one should come in the post. So that gave us an opportunity to explore this topic even further and provide our listeners with even more information from a health and safety perspective. The webinar itself will run for approximately 15 to 20 minutes. Then we'll be taking your questions at the end of the webinar. And please feel free to send over any of the questions that you may have. You can send any of the questions via the portal on the right-hand side of your screen. So again, we love your questions, so we'd love to be able to take them throughout the webinar, but if we can't get to them, we'll try and take them after the webinar itself. So without further ado, I'd like to get the kind of conversation started. And so first of all, Bridget, what's the problem with FFI, and as far as health and safety professionals are concerned?
I think the problem is that when an inspector used to go and visit a workplace, they used to be able to give people advice, and people would have quite a good relationship with their local health and safety inspector in a lot of cases. And so if they had a concern, they could ring up and they could say, "I'm worried about how we do this. Can you just chat through what we should be doing?" And that might mean that technically, at the point that you contacted the HSE, you weren't following the strict letter of the law, but you were trying to do the right thing. There wasn't any immediate danger. The HSE could advise you, and then things could improve. The concern is now that we still have prosecutions, we still have prohibition notices, we still have improvement notices. So the notice of contravention is for the less serious things, so things that don't quite reach the threshold of an improvement notice, but are still technically in breach of the law according to the HSE. And so the worry is now, if a health and safety person or manager in a business that contacts the HSE and says, "I think we might have a problem with this," they could actually get a notice of contravention in response.
You mentioned the legal costs of fighting the FFI could be more than the actual fee, in which case, why fight it?
The issue is going to be that if you are given a notice of contravention and you agree to it, well, then what you're agreeing is that the way you're doing things currently is in contravention of the law. So, for example, if the particular case that has challenged the fee for intervention process this year was a facilities company, OCS, who had done risk assessments on their management of vibration injuries, and they decided that where they could use sit-on mowers, they would, but that there were lots of situations where it was appropriate to use hand tools for vibration activities, so mowing grass and so on, and that because of the other issues, so manual handling and machinery issues, that on balance, the most reasonably practicable way of managing the hazard was sometimes to use hand tools. Now, if they paid up the fee for intervention based on that notice of contravention, they would have been agreeing that they would have to change their entire processes, which would have tied them to something that was just not practical to implement. So they would have had to have somehow had sit-on mowers for areas of grass that it was just not practical to get sit-on mowers into, for example. And then if anything had happened and they hadn't changed things the way that the HSE suggested, they would obviously have that held against them as evidence they'd agreed that what they were doing was wrong.
Yeah.
So in other words, although the cost of the paying the FFI might seem quite small, the implication of accepting the fee for intervention, if it's something where you have to change your entire process, may be much more expensive, orders of magnitude more expensive.
Okay, so again, yeah, this seemed to be an area of much discussion at the event last October. Where do the concepts of reasonably foreseeable and reasonably practicable come into this?
Okay, so we have some health and safety law where it's fairly prescriptive. So if you have an old building, you have to check whether it's got asbestos in it, and you have to have a register, and you have to show people the register, and that's fine. That's set out and that's prescribed. Similarly, things like Legionella. But a lot of health and safety law, because there are so many, technology changes, workplaces change. So the focus of the 1974 Health and Safety at Work Act is that you ensure health and safety of people who you affect so far as reasonably practicable, and that entails you don't have to protect against hazards that you couldn't guess. So we don't have to protect against alien invasions because they're not reasonably foreseeable. And you don't have to do more than is reasonably practicable to protect people. So you don't, for example, you don't solve lone working by giving every lone worker 3 armed bodyguards, because that wouldn't be a reasonably practicable way of dealing with the problem. Now, that's fine in principle, but you get 2 health and safety professionals in a room, and they won't agree on whether something is sufficiently probable to meet the reasonably foreseeable criteria. Nor will they necessarily agree on what the reasonably practicable way of approaching it is. So if you get a situation, going back to the OCS case, where people who understood the business and the nature of the business looked at it and said, yes, it's reasonably foreseeable that people will get vibration injuries, and we are doing everything reasonably practicable to control that, and then the HSE come along and say, well, we don't think you're doing everything reasonably practicable, then it's an opinion judgment rather than a simple black or white judgment.
Another question that just came up via one of our audience members. It was relating to NOC and notice of contravention. Can you give us a little bit more description on this, both from Bridget's and from Nick's perspective?
So NOC stands for notice of contravention, but yes, Nick is probably better positioned to give you the details on that.
The notice of contravention is what the inspector will issue to the duty holder, setting out why that inspector thinks there's been a material breach of health and safety law. The notice of contravention, the NOC, won't in itself amount to an invoice. The fee for intervention invoice will follow at a later date, but the notice of contravention is generally the thing that sets the ball rolling.
So Nick, from your perspective, is it a simple pay or don't pay question? Is FFI a simple pay or don't pay question?
Well, here's the typical lawyer's answer. It depends. There will be some cases where, as Bridget says, there will be a prescriptive aspect of health and safety law that requires remedying. So the asbestos register isn't where it should be, for example. That's a fairly simple question. There will be others, such as the OCS case, where the person receiving notice of contravention will dispute it. They don't accept there's been a material breach. In those circumstances, there may be very good reasons to fight. The disputes process has been changed recently to put in place a much more objective panel, if you like, including HSE experts who will be able to look at the situation and decide whether, in fact, there had been a material breach. So in the OCS case, they probably would have decided that there hadn't been. So in those sorts of cases, yes, there can be a very good reason to fight, get the notice of contravention overturned, and remove that from the HSE's file. The situations that are slightly more difficult are the ones where perhaps there is a material breach. You'd accept that there's a case to answer, So paying is the right thing to do, but you would want to make some sort of representation just to have on the HSE file, with an eye potentially to this developing to a prosecution at a later date, either in relation to that specific incident or a combination of them. So I think the message really is, whether you pay or don't pay, do have an eye on the longer term strategic consideration of how you respond.
So a question to Bridget, and from your perspective, what's the angle that you're coming from as a health and safety specialist? Do you think it's a simple pay, don't pay question?
I think the key point of my going into organisations is to try and make sure they don't get into that position in the first place. That you look at what you're doing, you identify what you should be doing. I mean, I do find I think it's quite a struggle in the industry at the moment, because on the one hand, we've got this great movement of this sort of safety to safety differently movement, who are saying, oh, it shouldn't all be about rules and procedures and things written down. We should be really focusing on letting people sort of work out for themselves how to keep safe. And that's a great idea in principle. But I think we know that the reality of it is that if an HSE inspector turns up and says, well, how are you managing this hazard? And we say, oh, well, they all know what they're doing. We just leave it to them because they know best how to keep themselves safe. Everybody wants to go home safely. You're going to have a little bit of a problem. So unfortunately, we are still tied to having procedures and documentation and so on. And I think, the best of the 21st century solution to that is to dump the idea of having all these procedures in folders and just writing more and more procedures, but to think about how we can make those the rules that people need to follow in the workplace, make them more readily available, whether that's through technology, through signage, through designing better equipment in the first place so that it's easier for people to get it right. But my key ambition is to get companies in the position where when the HSE inspector turns up, they say, yeah, actually, I can see you're doing all the right things. I can see that you've got health surveillance in place, that you've got prevention measures in place, that people know what they're doing. And we don't get into this fight or pay argument at all, because the HSE are quite happy with what you're doing, and you have the evidence to show them that you're doing the right thing.
So there's 30 days to pay, 21 days to appeal. From your perspective, and from a legal perspective, Nick, what are your opinions on these timescales, and how significant are they?
They're absolutely critical. The 21 day to appeal, whether you're dealing with a fee for intervention invoice or an enforcement notice, you need to keep to that deadline. If you don't, then you lose the opportunity to challenge it. In the case of fee for intervention, as I mentioned, the 21-day appeal process will start with service of the invoice, and that will usually come after the notice of contravention. So there will be a little bit more time to take stock and decide how you're going to respond. So when you get the notice of enforcement, start thinking quickly, but the 21 days to appeal will only start when the invoice is served. I mean, the key message, I think, is that these things need to be addressed quickly, without delay.
And to Nick, has there been any questions from customers or organisations about the timescales, more specifically?
I think the timescales are probably not front of people's minds. They're thinking about the subject matter, and although notice of the timelines will be given in the notice, maybe it's not something which always registers. So what we commonly find is that we will get instructed on a matter and we'll discover that a fee for intervention invoice was received many months ago, and it was not often paid without question. Individual invoices can be relatively inexpensive, and the average is sort of 650 to 700 quid over the last couple of years. They're paid, and then the duty holder will move on, and there's nothing we can do about it. So I think we don't get many questions about the deadlines, but from a lawyer's perspective, they are pretty important.
Yeah, and I think that reflects an attitude that I see in organisations where they, for example, will write a beautiful management plan about how they're going to manage a particular hazard, and then when you look at it and you say, well, why are you doing this? Or it'll refer to method statements, or the worst one is referring to a permit to work system, and you say, okay, show me your permit to work. Oh, we don't have one, but it's in your management plan that you have it. Well, yes, because we were told it needed to be in the management plan. And I think there's a sort of similar attitude to the notice of contravention, which is, right, well, we'll say we're going to do the right thing and pay up because that's the cheapest, quickest thing to do. Rather than, you're in that, in the same way that if you write a management plan that says you're going to do A, B, and C and you do D, E, and F, you're in a worse position than if you didn't have a management plan at all. And yet I constantly see that in organisations. So I think it's that same attitude that says, oh, well, we'll pay up and keep the HSE happy, and then they'll leave us alone, without realising that effectively they've just written something, by accepting that NOC, they've just written something into their management plan that they now have to do, whether they realise that or not.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And coming back to the sort of middle ground about pay or don't pay, if the view's taken that it's going to be cheaper and quicker and less of a hassle to pay up, well, that's a perfectly legitimate commercial decision to make. But if you're doing that whilst not accepting there's been a material breach, then there needs to be some representation made to the HSE, because almost invariably now, when we see prosecutions, one aspect of the prosecution case that we'll see is, well, there was, they received a fee for intervention invoice and they paid it. It's a tacit admission, as Bridget, you say. So I think to avoid that situation, if there is going to be payment in what is a potentially disputable situation, then having some sort of representation on the HSE file, I would regard as essential.
Yes, and I think again it's going back to your earlier question, David, about reasonably foreseeable. It's breaking that connection, because by paying the invoice, you're saying, okay, we agree with you that it is reasonably foreseeable that the way we are behaving will lead to this type of injury or this type of accident. Whereas if you sort of, as Nick suggests, if you get a lawyer to write you a letter to say, actually, we don't accept the link between the way we're operating and this outcome, then I guess you're standing in a better position if you need to use reasonably foreseeable as a defence later on. But certainly making it clear that you don't see that the way you are operating is going to lead to that outcome, I think is the clear bit that needs to be in there.
So we're coming towards the end of the webinar, and want to make sure that we get some of your questions over to us. So again, please feel free to send them over throughout the webinar itself. So first off, Bridget, from a health and safety perspective background, what would you feel is your best advice to organisations and to health and safety managers tackling the subject matter of FFI?
I don't think it's changed particularly since the original 1992 Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. It is identify your hazards, work out what it is you're doing, identify the hazards in what you're doing, identify who you're going to hurt, work out how you're going to stop those people being hurt, write it all down and keep it under review. Don't start trying to worry about putting numbers on severity and likelihood. I think that's a waste of time in most cases. Just make sure that you've got all your controls in place and that those controls are monitored, because again, I see organisations who have apparently great monitoring systems, and then you sort of say, well, where are your records of these workplace inspections or these audits or the training that your documents say you do? And it's like, oh, I don't know if we leave that to line management, sort of thing. And again, you need to have all of that data at your fingertips to be able to say, oh yeah, everybody has had refresher training this year in whatever it is, manual handling or work at height. We have carried out workplace inspections. We can show all of this, but doing it using, use 21st century technology to do it. Don't try and do it on bits of paper and Excel spreadsheets and think that you're advanced. Use the systems that are out there to make that just part of every day, so that it's not, this is my job, this is health and safety. It's just like, okay, this is what I do, and it includes health and safety.
And from your perspective, Nick, What do you think is the best advice again from to organisations and to health safety matters relating to FFI?
Well, I think early action is the key message, really. If you think that there is a basis to dispute the notice of contravention, get legal advice straight away. Don't hang around. It's possible that through dialogue with the HSE inspector, it might be possible to persuade him or her that they're mistaken, so the invoice doesn't get issued at all. If the invoice does get issued, well, think about whether or not to go through the query and then dispute process. If you go through the dispute process, well, there is a panel comprising a legal member and 2 health and safety experts independent of the HSC. It is possible to engage with them. You will get disclosure of relevant documentation from them and an explanation of the HSE inspector's decision and reasoning. It is possible to meet with that panel, so you might be able to persuade them that actually the inspector was mistaken and all of the systems that Bridget was describing are in place and are being implemented, and get the invoice overturned. But you know, the starting point really is addressing this issue early and getting legal advice early.
So still, yeah, any questions you might have, please feel free to send them over. One thing both of you mentioned was, I think from both Nick and Bridget mentioned, was the importance of a sound and solid health and safety system. From my perspective and from a software perspective, what is the importance of that being implemented, and what do you think is best approach?
Well, I'll give you an example, and I'll give you an example of something that effective software don't do, so that I'm clearly not trying to market it. And that's COSH, so Control of Substances Hazardous to Health. In that, you know, I have amongst my contacts at different stages come across organisations who have bottles of chemicals in their cupboards which have been there for 20 years, with no idea of what they have, what they're using, what they're doing with it. No control over it. No, you know, if someone came in and said, okay, you know, what substances have you got and how can they harm people, they wouldn't necessarily know. And again, you know, there are systems out there which specialise in helping you to manage your substances hazardous to health, which mean that your safety data sheets are updated automatically when something changes. You know, if there's a change in EU regulations relating to a substance, that you can get support in producing task-specific assessments for your COSH and so on. That all of that data is, you know, available on a tablet device, on a mobile phone, when you need it, as you need it, rather than, oh, I think the folder is in someone's room 3 floors up, and it's got a 25-year-old safety data sheet in it. You know, all of that sort of information can be up to date, and it can then really make sure that people are doing the job well. It can help with your procurement, because if you find out that the same substance is being used in 4 different departments and bought separately, you can save money by improving your procurement strategies. There's so much there, and then, you know, when the inspector calls and says, how are you managing your hazardous substances, you can say, let me show you, and you sit them down in front of a computer, and, you know, they're bewildered and go, wow, that's amazing, and walk away.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. From a legal perspective, you know, I'm in the business of proving things at court or other tribunals, and you know, having a system which is working in the sense that people are doing the right thing, well, that's, you know, that is great. But being able to demonstrate that often requires having a record of what people have done, and you know, that comes back to what Bridget was saying. Being able to demonstrate, have proof of what's actually been happening is key.
And I think the other advantage with having a software-based system is that, again, I've gone into organisations where one of my responsibilities might be to check that, you know, in the 12 months since my previous visit, then the local manager has been making certain checks. And when I go and look at their checklists, I see that their checks for the last 12 months were all done on the 3rd of the month, all written in the same biro and the same handwriting. and clearly were done the day before my visit. Now, on a computer, you can't do that because the computer will timestamp when you made an entry, so it will know whether you made the entry a month ago or whether you made them all yesterday, and so you have that much better audit trail of when people do things. You can have automatic escalation if people don't do things, rather than I wouldn't need to go in at all if that particular organisation had a computer-based system for checking. They wouldn't even need me because it would be flagged up when the local manager hadn't done their checks. They wouldn't need me to go and look at the paperwork. So there's a huge cost saving in there. So that's another advantage that the computer-based systems would have over the traditional paper method.
So I know we're about to hit the 11 o'clock clock timing there, and I made sure to not go over this, and I don't want to be taking too much of your time of the day. I wanted just to mention that I will be sending on the recording of the webinar, hopefully this afternoon. So if you have any questions relating to any of the content that's coming from the webinar, please feel free to contact me, and I will be able to get back to you as soon as possible. So I would like to now take the time to thank both Bridget and Nick for their cooperation and hard work that they've provided with me over the last few weeks around the subject matter. And I think there's some really, really good discussion matters that we've gone into more detail. So again, much thanks to you guys, and thank you for all your help. So I'd like to take the time to thank our audience for giving us your time away from your busy schedules. Again, much appreciated. We will be hosting a number of webinars coming into the new year, so be sure to listen out for our next topic. This will be via social media as well as our mail campaigns. So thanks again for your cooperation, and hope to talk soon.